Hello and good afternoon, friends. Welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in this session, we are going to continue on our series on basic sociology. And under this series, today we would be talking on classical sociological theories. And for this discussion, we have once again with us in our studios, Professor Maitri Chaudhary. Professor Maitri Chaudhary is from Center for Study of Social System, JNU. Dear friends, if you want to ask questions on today's topic from Professor Maitri Chaudhary, you can call right in the studio. You can ask questions from her through our toll-free number. Our number is 1800-110-430. I repeat, our number is 1800-110-430. Dear friends, you are requested to call in the last 10 minutes so that the lectures goes uninterrupted as well as your queries are also resolved, but in the last 10 minutes. So taking the lecture forward, let's welcome our guest, Professor Maitri Chaudhary, once again. Hello, ma'am.
Thank you very much. Today we are going to have a discussion on classical sociological theories. And the three theories that one has identified is Karl Marx, Emile Durkheim, Max Weber. And, when I repeat Karl Marx, it's important that you look at the dates, 1818 to 1883. Emile Durkheim, 1858 to 1917. Max Weber, 1864 to 1920. This is important because they are all from the 19th century. The reason I'm emphasizing these dates is to foreground the context within which these theories were articulating the theories that they did. Karl Marx, 1818 to 1883, Durkheim, 1858 to 1917, Max Weber, 1864 to 1920. The reason why this period is important is that many of the issues that they were discussing were in fact emerged from the context within which they were living. What were these contexts? These contexts, what was happening in Europe in the 19th century? In Europe in the 19th century, what was happening was that you had a situation where there was great and dramatic transformation taking place. You will recall in an earlier lecture when we were discussing the growth and nature of sociology, we had identified three processes which we had said had deep implications in the manner in which sociology as a discipline developed. Those three incidents or events or processes were the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, and the industrial capitalism. Those three issues are evident in the kind of issues that these theorists or thinkers were looking at. For instance, you find in Marx, you find in Weber, and you find in Durkheim a great emphasis on understanding what was happening to the social world around them, the kind of transformations that were taking place around them, the sense that there was a certain kind of dislocations which was happening around them. The certainty which defined traditional society seemed to have changed. They felt that everything was moving in a certain fundamental sense. The emphasis for all these theories was therefore to grasp the social change that took place with the onset of modernity. In other words, all these theorists are looking at questions of social transformation in modern Western Europe. Now, the first question that many of you would have is that these developments were very far away. So how does it help us in our part of the country to understand our modernity, our industrial revolution, our capitalism, or our scientific developments or technological innovations? And this is what we are going to try and explain, that though these issues which these theories addressed were local to the European context of that period of time, the transformations that were generated by modernity, whether it was capitalism, whether it was technological innovations, whether it was the emergence of nation state, whether it was rapid communications, impinged upon developments elsewhere. Most evidently, it impinged on the development of colonialism. Just as you had the growth of capitalism in the West, so we had the growth of colonialism in our country. So this connection is something that all of you must remember and look at when you study theorists of this classical period or the classical theorists. The second point, apart from being theorists of modernity, relevant to the contemporary period because we are still inhabiting the period of modernity, they were people who were trying to develop a certain scientific understanding of the social. You will recall in our earlier classes, we discussed the distinction between a common sense perspective and a sociological or a scientific perspective. So whether it was Durkheim, whether it was Marx or whether it was Weber, they were all articulating a certain kind of methodological framework in order to understand the social. So the first point, theorists of modernity, relevant to understand contemporary modernity. Second, that they were articulating a certain method to understand the social, which is relevant in the contemporary context. The third point that I am very keen on emphasizing is the fact that when we study these theorists, very often we look at them as really people who are frozen in time in the kind of textbooks or definitions or guidebooks that we study. An attempt that I am trying to make here is to make them come alive. Make them come alive in a certain sense by emphasizing the context within which they lived, and second, by drawing upon certain original quotes from their writing. I think that is very, very important for them to look at, because if you read their context, the kind of quotes that I will sort of put in the slides, you will get a sense of where does it come from and what I mean by the question of method. I quote, for instance, from Karl Marx, 1818 to 1883, from the German ideology, "Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past." You will ask me, what does this quote mean? What kind of implications does it have for us as sociologists or students of sociology to understand social reality? The simple point that is evident in this quote is that human beings have agency, that is, they have volition or will. They have, in other words, an ability to do things on their own. They can make history. But, and the but is important, they do not make history or they do not make their choices as they please, that whatever they wish to, they make those choices in specific given circumstances, in specific given situations, and these situations have a historical past. I'll sort of spend a little bit of time explaining what this means. It means that we have choice, we have agency, but this choice is not free, it's not unlimited. It is in a certain sense constrained by the historical circumstances in which we are. When I emphasize the history, it again refers to a very key approach of Marx. You're very familiar probably with two concepts which Marxist theory talks about. One, historical materialism, the other, dialectical materialism. When he said historical materialism, the understanding is that you cannot understand the present without a reference to history. The materialism means that you cannot understand the contemporary social or any social unless you look at the manner in which human beings materially produce their conditions of living and the material conditions of production and reproduction. So this is what was understood by historical materialism. But I want to go back to the quote, "Men make their history but only under circumstances which are given," to give you an example. Many of you are young people. You are probably preparing for your examinations or probably trying for jobs. Each of you are free in a certain sense to pursue your dreams. You are free to decide that, look, I'm going to take sociology and not psychology, or I'm free to take computer sciences and not something else. You are free. Finally, the decision is yours. But at the same time, you know that very often the decision that you take is influenced by parents. They are influenced by the job opportunities available. This is influenced by probably the socio-economic conditions within which you are, that maybe you wanted to do something, but the compulsions of earning or the compulsions of family obligations made you do certain kind of things. So there is a play of freedom and constraint. Central in the slide that I mentioned, the slide, men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. This refers to, in fact, a key theoretical idea, the relationship between the individual and society. In other words, the relationship between the individual who has agency, who has free will, and society which has an ability to constrain. This is one quote that I sort of spent a little bit of time to familiarize you as to how these theories laid the foundation of a sociological perspective. The second slide, which is same slide as the one which I just quoted from, is from A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, another work of Karl Marx. And it's a small quote. I read, "It is not the consciousness of men that determine their being, but on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness." In a certain sense, this quote is related to the earlier quote, that it's not our ideas which make us what we are, but it is, on the other hand, the who we are, which kind of context we live in, which kind of social class, nationality, community, stratification, which location we occupy that determine the consciousness that we have. I'll give you a very simple example. If one comes from a very affluent background, a very wealthy background, then probably you do not have any constraint of getting a job in the same way as somebody who comes from a marginalized section would have. The constraints are different. So the consciousness, the sense of being free would be very differently felt by different kinds of people. Likewise, take the category of gender. Probably men would have a different sense or notion of freedom than women would have. To so repeat, it's not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but on the contrary, their social being, who they are, where they are, their location, that determines their consciousness. This is important. There's a one point that I want to sort of draw your attention to, is that all of the time the reference is to men, not to women. Now this is again refers to a point which I had mentioned in an earlier discussion, that knowledge shifts, knowledge changes. At the time that they were writing, you did not have the same kind of awareness as you have today about gender perspective, and that when we must use she, he, we should also take care to use she. So you have a certain contextuality within which these theorists wrote. But again, to reiterate, notice that in both these quotes that I gave from two of his works, German Ideology and second, A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, the emphasis is on understanding that you cannot understanding the individual unless you locate the individual in society. Now we come to another slide. And this is a quote, a largish quote from Karl Marx, the Communist Manifesto, and I'd like you to read it very carefully. I won't go into details of reading from it, but what I will do it is to show to you that what he was trying to do in the Communist Manifesto is to describe the nature of capitalism. That is relevant to us even today. The first thing that he says is that capitalism and the people who are the dominant people, or the capitalists or the bourgeoisie, they have to constantly innovate, constantly revolutionize the instruments of production. And if they do not do it, they would not be in a position to generate profit. So there is something which is very, very dynamic about capitalism. This is important because even in the contemporary period, you are aware that in India, for example, at one point, the information technology sector was doing so well. the IT sector was constantly innovating, they had acquired global prominence, and all of a sudden you may have a situation where you may have a certain kind of loss of jobs in the IT sector. There has to be therefore constant innovation. This dynamism of capitalism is what made the classical theorists realize that nothing is fixed forever. Unlike traditional societies, everything in modernity is constantly changing. And this is a quote from Marx, which is very famous: all fixed, fast, frozen relations, with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions, are swept away. All that is solid melts into air. All that was sacred has become profane. There was this certain emphasis that what was so stable in a traditional society has suddenly changed. In the Indian context, for example, in a certain sense, colonialism brought in this dramatic transformation, because in our country, capitalism came in the reins of colonialism, and you had that kind of dramatic shift, migration, people, plantation workers taken from, say, Jharkhand to Assam tea plantations, workers who went from Bihar to maybe the jute mills of Calcutta, someone else who went as indentured labor from Bihar to Suriname or the coast of Orissa or Tamil Nadu to different parts of Southeast Asia, North Africa, Latin America. So this aspect of capitalism was very central in the understanding of the sociological theorists, and they become relevant to us. Because finally, why do we do theories? We do theories so that we are able to understand the empirical, we are able to understand the social which surrounds us. There's a last quote from Marx: there is no royal road to science, and this is from his work Capital, Volume 1. There is no royal road to science, and only those who do not dread the fatiguing climb of its steep paths have a chance of gaining its luminous summits. What is he trying to say? He's trying to say that, look, you cannot understand reality scientifically in any easy fashion. It's not something which is like, a kind of ready-made food or instant coffee or instant tea or any of this instant fast food which can be instantly got. Science entails labor, pursuit, times. It takes a lot of work, a lot of patience in order to pursue and understand what is it which constitutes reality. Just one line before I move on to another theorist, that the theories are basically trying to illuminate the empirical. To go back to an earlier class, we had said that, look, we cannot access the social or the empirical just like that, because what you see is not necessarily what others see. And if there is a contradiction between what you see and what others see, then there has to be a reason why different people are looking at the same phenomena in very different ways. And the example that you can get in a world like today is that you have a particular event, maybe you have firing at a particular crowd, and the media reports that firing, and one section of people are in support of the firing. Another section of people are against that firing. How do you explain that? How do you understand that? Do you go back and say that you have to understand the individual perception or the group perception by understanding the location within which they are located and how they perceive this objective or intersubjective reality? That is, the objective reality out there is not like a ball that I just pick up the ball and I grasp it physically. It is something which has to be grasped through a very painful scientific process, and only then we would be able to do it. To go back to what I was trying to say, to repeat, all these theories belong to the 19th century. All these theories were influenced by ideas of science, by ideas of enlightenment, and they were interested in understanding the social world on similar lines as the natural world, that they felt that we cannot accept the common sense knowledge as the given knowledge. Social knowledge is far more complicated, and just as in the physical sciences you need theories to explore or display or illuminate what is there in the empirical, likewise in social sciences we need theory and we need method to explore what is it that which goes behind the social. So first is the question of method, and we show through Karl Marx's quotes how he looked at the question of method, that is the whole question of historical materialism. You have to look at history, and second, the materialist conditions of production and reproduction. What do I mean by this whole question of materialism and historical materialism? The history part is simple. What is materialism? Marx was trying to argue with earlier philosophers, in particular European and German philosophers, who he felt were erring in understanding the social by beginning with ideas and not by beginning with social existence. What do I mean by that? I mean, supposing, let's take a sociological example, I want to understand my family. I have ideas about my family, and I try to understand my family through the ideas I have about family, that a mother is not supposed to work, a father is supposed to be the breadwinner, siblings are supposed to fight, the girl is supposed to get married and leave the family. You have certain concepts of what a good family or a bad family or functional family or dysfunctional family is. But this is my middle class understanding, maybe an urban middle class understanding of a family. You may have a family which is headed by a woman. You may have a family where your mother is an agricultural worker. Maybe your mother is somebody who collects fuel and water from other areas and brings it back. You have very different experiences of the family. Therefore, we cannot study a phenomena through the common sense ideas that we have of that phenomena. We have to move apart and try to then understand family as a social institution, and as a social institution located within a historically specific period. That is, maybe my great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents did not live in the kind of family that I live in. Maybe my children will not live in the kind of family that I live in. That is, there is a historicity on one hand, and second, it has to be linked to the material conditions of your production. What kind of work do you? Where are you located in the division of labor? Where are you located in the whole question of class structure? That is the whole question of historical materialism. What does dialectical materialism mean? Dialectical materialism, what it means is that there is a certain dialectical relationship between the individual and society. If you recall our first quote where you said you both have freedom to make history, but not as you wish to, but in certain kind of given circumstances. So that aspect, that is dialectical, it is mutual, it is reciprocal. That in some senses we are products of history, but we are also able to change history. But that dialectic, that connection is interconnected, it's mutual, it is reciprocal. So that is the whole element of dialectical. But unlike other idealist philosophers with whom Marx was debating, for instance, Hegel, who had a certain understanding of dialectics, or in our own philosophical traditions we have a certain understanding of dialectics. What was emphasized by Marx was that it has to be dialectics, but also in connection with a certain materialist understanding of society. In other words, a society has to be understood by the manner in which it produced its sustenance, the instruments of production, the tools which it produced in order to produce, reproduction, the kind of family, community, relationships that they had with other, the question of social relations of production. Just a quick example to give you instances of how instruments of production change from one society to the other. All of you may be today familiar with call centers, which are global call centers. We have a lot of that in India, and they are servicing global centers. Their instruments of production are extremely different from the kind of instruments of production maybe early factory workers of cotton textile workers in Bombay had in the 19th century, or the jute workers had in Calcutta in the 19th century. That is, the instruments of production change from one epoch to the other. And then a very interesting point which Marx makes when he says, what you are is what you produce. That is, the instruments of production in turn define the kind of culture or life forms that you have. We now come to the second theorist. We'll sort of discuss that in greater detail in the next class, but I want to sort of identify and flag off some of the issues. To go back, the first is that Emile Durkheim had this very well-known book called The Division of Labor, 1893. And he emphasizes, like Marx, on the question of division of labor. But unlike Marx, the division of labor in Durkheim is about specialization in modern industry. It's not so much division of labor as being the same as division of property, which was the question of Marx. But the point I want you to go back when I said that this was again an issue about the kind of changes that modernity was bringing out. That modernity was a kind of society which was not the same as traditional society. Traditional society were often seen, particularly simple societies, that a simple society which did not have very specialized forms of labor or very distinguished or differentiated forms of production, were relatively homogeneous. People were relatively like each other. The kind of societies which people said described what we within quotes call was a simple society, a tribal society to which all of us at one point or the other belonged, where your mode of production was simple. It was primarily production for sustenance. That was very simple division of labor. Whereas with modernity, you had complex forms of division of labor. Now, this division of labor is an aspect of modernity which is common to both Marx, it is common to Durkheim, and it's common to Weber. So many of the categories which refer to the division of labor, like class, like status, like power, like different forms of stratification, are very central in their theories. I'll be spending a little more time in the next lecture on the kind of issues that they looked at, particularly with reference to division of labor, and then I will be looking into the kind of cultural forms or beliefs and practices or sense that people felt, people's feelings during that period of time. But right now, just very quickly, what is it that I was trying to argue? I was trying to argue that first thing that you must do is locate these thinkers. They belong to the 19th century. They were grappling with modernity and dramatic social transformation which was taking place in Europe. A transformation which led to great urbanization, growth of slums. You had different kinds of family formations. You had various kinds of new forms of anarchy, what Durkheim calls anomie, Marx calls alienation. But this is something that I'll be discussing in the next class. Yeah, so we sort of continue with our discussion on the classical sociological thinkers. And what I had flagged off in my last discussion is that the two things which I'm emphasizing today. One is their engagement with modernity, and second is their ability and the way they developed a certain kind of scientific method. And perhaps I should add a third aspect, that their kind of anxiety that this new modern forms, created in Western Europe, which reflected in the kind of sense of disorientation or dislocation which people felt when suddenly confronted with these kind of dramatic changes. One thing I would like to tell you, that these classical thinkers wrote voluminously. They are thinkers who are not so easy to understand, but not so difficult either, and that's one of the reasons I'm using the quotes from the original sources to give you a certain sense. But what I'm speaking on is essentially selective. It's like giving a trailer of what they really are, and I really hope that some of you would be encouraged to explore the original works and find that they have so much to offer in understanding the very modern, contemporary, second decade, 21st century India. So I begin with Emile Durkheim's division of labor, where I stopped in my last lecture. And the point that he's trying to say here is that, there is constant divisions and specialization and greater technological innovations in the contemporary period. And in an earlier period, you had philosophers who reflected on life. You didn't have so many kind of compartmentalized disciplines. I'll give you many examples. And one of the examples a lot of you would be very familiar is that when you go to a hospital, and when you talk to your older generation and ask them about their experiences as children and when they went to hospitals or when they went to doctors. Today, when you fall ill, the first thing is that you have to go to a specialist. And the specialist in turn may send you to somebody who's a super specialist. There is increasingly atomization of specialization in a certain sense of time. And this is something, I'm sure during Durkheim's period you didn't have the kind of specialization that we have today, but he was aware that this is where modern world is moving towards. It's a kind of specialized world. It's a world where people are going to do very different kind of work. In this context, Durkheim introduced two very important concepts. One, mechanical solidarity, and the second, organic solidarity. What are these two concepts? One is the mechanical solidarity is referring to a non-modern society, to what we call a simple society, to a society where there is not so much specialization and not so much differentiation and division of labor. People roughly do similar kind of things. And he says here that the solidarity is mechanical, that you don't really have to make efforts. So when you have, say, a couple who are potters and the man and the woman work together in their production of whatever pottery that they are making, that the relationship here is mechanical. You know what you're supposed to do. And there is also, in a certain sense, relationship between different people. You know who the others are and what they are doing. This is very different from modern society, where he talks about the whole question of organic solidarity, which is a sort of more complicated kind of concept, that how is it visible, how do we find it? So each of these questions that these thinkers are discussing is about divisions of labor and the kind of social structure or the kind of solidarity which emerges in different kinds of society. As you recall, in my earlier talk, I mentioned that you have all these classical theorists who have been emphasizing on how they must study the social. In this context, Durkheim wrote this book called Rules of Sociological Method in 1895. And he makes this absolutely incredible but simple point that, look, all of us dress and do things not in the way that we necessarily would personally like to do, but what we do is according to the country that I live in, according to the class that I occupy, according to my fear of what people may or may not say to me, whether there would be ridicule or not. So he says that, look, you have to understand that there are conventions or there are norms in society which impinge on us. And in this context, he introduced a concept called a social fact. What is a social fact? A social fact is every way of acting, fixed or not, capable of exercising on the individual an external constraint, every way of acting which is general throughout a given society and which exists in its own right independent of individual manifestation. I would like to explain what this means. This again is trying to say that, look, you cannot understand the social just through your common sense ideas. You have to have a category, a concept, and the concept of social fact will help you to understand whether what you are studying is actually a social fact or not. So the first example he gives is that it has to be external to the individual. For example, when a child is born, a child does not choose the language that becomes the mother tongue of the child. That is the constraint. The child already confronts the language that she or he has to learn automatically because of the objective conditions within which the child is born. The religion that the child usually follows would be the religion of the family. It is a given. It is external to the individual. Maybe the clothes which we wear, maybe the customs which we have, maybe the food which we eat are external to us. He in fact gives this example that when a baby is born, the baby, as many of you would know, does not know when to sleep and when to be awake. So young mothers and family members would say the baby decides it's time to play maybe in the middle of the night, whereas the others are very sleepy. But over a period of time, socialization ensures that the child learns when to sleep, when to feel hungry, and when to play. That is, even what you feel are your own volitional actions are social facts because you have learned them from external sources. You learned to do it in a particular way. That is the external part of it. Why is it general? It is general, he says, because it exists independent of individual manifestation. What do you mean by exists independent of individual manifestation? It means that you speak a particular language, maybe you speak Tamil or you speak Hindi, not because each of you speak Hindi or Tamil, the Tamil becomes the language of the community. But what is important, that it exists as a general fact in that community, irrespective of whether you are born at all or not born or whether you are a member. It exists independent. Therefore, it is general. It is external, it is general. The third point, it is coercive. What do you mean by coercive? That it imposes itself on you. You are taught that you must wash your hands before you eat. You must study at a particular time. You must show respect maybe to your elders in a particular fashion. Maybe this is how there is a certain kind of constraint. And if you do not do it, for example, in our societies, there are very often lots of restrictions on young women. So there would be restrictions on a young woman going out, and if a young woman goes out, people may say that, look, and if there is a sexual assault, people may say that, look, she deserved it, she went out. This is the constraint, that is, you're violating against social norms which impinges upon you. So you have a situation where they are external, they are general, they are coercive. But Durkheim also introduces an interesting word of a deviant, that somebody who then decides that this norm has to be challenged, or a historical point of time that the norm decides to be questioned and interrogated, and you have a different norm which comes into place. There's a fourth aspect that he adds to the question of social fact. General, we've discussed. External, we've discussed. Coercive, we discussed. And he says, Durkheim says, but how will you know? What will be the test by you know whether this is a social fact or not? And the point that he says is, you will know that if you go against it, there will be resistance. That is, people are going to punish you. For example, you may have a situation where in your community you're not supposed to marry people who are related to you in a certain order by kinship, and if you do so, the family or the biradri may act against you, and that would be, you would know therefore that there is an element of resistance. You're going against something and there are sanctions. You would have various other kinds of sanctions, maybe against the state, maybe a traffic light. You violate it, you are fined, that there are certain kind of constraints. So social fact for Durkheim therefore became a very, very important way by going and breaking away from what is called common sense, common ideas to kind of sociological understanding. The other text that he wrote was very well known, called Suicide, written in 1897. And in the case of suicide, he made this remarkable proposition which he went around to prove that suicide is not only and necessarily psychological, that it could be social and linked to the integration of the society and the kind of solidarity that society has. So a society which is integrated very well, the possibilities of suicide in such a society would be less. And he brought this kind of proposition to test by comparing statistical data of suicides between two communities, the Catholics and the Protestants, arguing that the Catholics are a more integrated community and that therefore the rate of suicide was lower. The other aspect which Durkheim studied, which very few people studied, was the question of religion, elementary forms of religious life. And Durkheim broke away from many of the other theorists of religion by arguing that, look, you have to understand religion as a social phenomenon. He made no hierarchy. He did not make any distinction like many other Western theorists of religion did by saying that certain religions are revealed religions or truth or civilized and the others are barbaric, etc. What he said, there is one feature which characterizes all religious forms, whichever religion that you study, and introduce the concept of the sacred and the profane. And that is, something in every religion is so sacred, something in every religion is profane. And he also develops the whole idea of how we articulate our notions of form, how do we understand space and time, and the manner in which we represent this. There is no time to do it. I'm just flagging off certain points so which may be of certain interest to you. But what is important, again, to say that all these classical theorists were interested in developing a method and a theory to understand the social, number one, and they were interested in the manner in which you had production, division of labor operating in modernity. And the third is the whole question that they realize the subjective characteristics of human beings in different societies change depending upon the social structure. In other words, they were all looking at the relationship between the individual and society. I come lastly to Max Weber, 1864 to 1920, and as in the case of Durkheim and as in the case of Marx, there is no time to look into details. I'm sure that you will have the opportunity and desire to look at it at some point of time. I'm just flagging off a couple of these texts. One is the whole question of science as a vocation, which he wrote in 1917, and Weber, like Durkheim and like Marx, was wanting to understand the nature of modernity, and he introduced this whole question of rational action, intellectualization, and a very important word, disenchantment of the world. The ultimate and most sublime values have retreated from public life, either into the transcendental realm of mystic life or into the brotherliness of direct and personal human relations. You remember that that Marx mentioned all that is sacred has melted, all that has dramatically changed. Likewise, Weber says, look, the world has become disenchanted. Everything is different from what it was. The kind of sacred sanctity or the norms which we had in an earlier period seems to have changed with modernity. It's either becoming compartmentalized. So like in the modern world, you say that, look, this is your world of work, and then you go and do meditation. That's your spiritual world. There's a certain kind of specialization which takes place. Here, I just also want to bring in two words, like Weber's disenchantment. I want to bring in the word alienation, which Marx introduced, and the word anomie, which Durkheim introduced. In both cases, they were trying to identify the kind of transition or dramatic transformation which was taking place in society. In everyday life, even today, we say the world has changed so fast. Everything is so different. Parents look at their children differently, children look at parents differently, marriages are differently done, friendships are differently done, people decide to migrate from one country and settle in another country. There is entire transformation. Very often that leads to a sense of bewilderment, a sense of anarchy, a sense what Durkheim calls anomie, a sense what Weber calls disenchantment, what in another sense Marx calls alienation. So you find that these theories offer you certain kind of concepts or ways by which we will be able to understand the problems of modernity as we confront it together in contemporary world. The other text of Max Weber, which I am very quickly flagging off, is that Max Weber, like Marx, like Durkheim, also articulated a certain method of analysis. That how do we understand the social world? Unlike the emphasis on the causal, it's not that Weber did not emphasize the causal, he emphasized the causal, but he also emphasized on what was called the interpretative method. That is the way that he said, I'll give you an example of how he explained social action. That social action, you can't only understand it by the physical act that a person is performing, that I am now trying to give a lecture, I am using a PowerPoint presentation, that is physical, what you can see, but that you will be able to understand what I am doing only if you are familiar with what teaching means, what sociology means, what lecture means. Otherwise, somebody who is not familiar with what I am doing or what you are doing may just find it jumbo mumbo, that I am staring to open air and speaking, that unless you are aware of the meaning which I am attributing to the act of speaking, you will not be able to understand social reality. So Weber has been sort of credited with this whole question of interpretative meaning, or looking at questions of meaningful action. The other aspect which Weber looked at is the different kind of actions which define our contemporary world. One, instrumental action, value instrumental rationality, value rationality, affectual rationality, traditional rationality. Again, in each of this you will be able to identify modern spheres of life, questions of modernity. When we say, oh, she is so instrumental, that is, take the example of networking. For my generation, this concept of networking is new. For the contemporary young people, networking is part of your professional life, that you cannot move ahead in life unless you network. But networking has an instrumental purpose, that you make relationships in order to further certain kind of interests. Instrumental rationality becomes dominant in modernity. The second, value rationality, that is the value that I hold good, which drives me to certain kind of action. That may be a certain kind of belief in religion, maybe a certain ethical belief, maybe a belief that as I grow older, I must move apart, I must disengage myself. That may be a belief which I draw from a certain value within which I have been brought up. That is value rationality. The third is affectual, that is the sense of emotive relationships, emotional feelings, affectual relationships which drive you to certain kind of actions. And the fourth, the traditional, which is by ingrained habituation, that we do certain things because that's what we are accustomed to do. We do it not because we've thought it out, not because it's instrumental, not because we have a certain value attached to it, not because we feel particularly emotionally driven to it, but because this is something we have always learned and become habituated. These notions, these concepts of instrumental or value or affectual or traditional action would be what Weber calls ideal type. This is one of the last concepts of Weber I am addressing. Ideal types are conceptual categories which are supposed to be pure types. They may not be empirically corresponding to how things actually work out in reality. Say he wrote about bureaucracy, and he said that how a bureaucracy should work, of impersonal roles, certain kind of examinations, anonymity, etc. Bureaucracy actually, say in a country like ours, may not work like that. But The ideal form gives you an analytical category by which you will be able to analyze the empirical. Again, therefore, you see the way they use concepts is to enable us to understand the social and empirical in a particular systematic fashion and go beyond the obvious. I sort of end, the whole questions about these three, classical thinkers very quickly by focusing on certain key concepts and certain key points. To reiterate, they all belong to the 19th century West Europe. Durkheim was French, Marx was German, and Weber was German. This was the site of intense industrial revolution, growth of capitalism, growth of rationality, growth of a new kind of society. They were confronted with the transformations. People felt alienated, people felt anarchic, people felt rootless, rudderless. In such a society, they said, look, we have to make sense of this world. Make sense of this world not philosophically, not theologically, not spiritually, but understanding why this is taking place. Why is this transformation taking place? The second point that they were looking at is what is the relationship between the individual and the society? What is the dynamic, the dialectical relationship between the individual and society, between history or constraint and freedom? How free are we? Am I free? I am free to speak what I am, but I am constrained by the time that I am given to speak. Could I have spoken the same in another historical situation when you did not have the technological innovations that we have today? So the question of volition and the question of constraint. The question of the subjective feeling and the objective structures, the realization that very often the affectual, or what we feel, what people feel and what people think and what people do are things which happen because of the conditions within which they are. They shifted in a fundamental sense, all of them shifted a fundamental sense, an approach to study reality through ideas, that you do not begin with ideas, you begin with being. You do not begin with consciousness, you begin with what exists. So if I want to study Indian society in the contemporary period in 2017, I do not begin with the idea that I have of India, but what I begin is with the empirical reality, the industrial transformation, urbanization, that Indian villages are far becoming sometimes small towns, growth of tier 2 towns, new kind of transformations. This will not help if I have a kind of fixed notion about India and I then proceed to pontificate and say this is India. As a sociologist, as a social scientist, borrowing and drawing from the classical thinkers, I have to learn to go and enter the objective reality. Enter the objective reality not just by jumping into it, but through the theoretical conceptual frameworks they have provided us, which enables us then to understand what is happening around us. The final point that I want to sort of raise and start sort of flag it off so that maybe you could think about it, that very often people ask this question that these are Western theorists. They are 19th century theorists. What relevance would it have to understand 21st century India? And what you have to understand that modernity, capitalism, right from the beginning were global phenomena. When the West got capitalism, we were colonized. So we were part of modernity right from the beginning. Look at the dates which I flagged off. 19th century, India was already colonized in 19th century. 1857, we had the first war of independence. Our thinkers and philosophers and writers and national movement leaders and social reformers were already informed of what was happening in the West. We cannot throw it away. What we have to ask is that did the modernity which take place in the West replicated in our context, or was there a historically specificity which we have to engage with? That's the first question, that these theorists are not irrelevant, but perhaps they have to be tweaked with the body of knowledge which has been produced in our context to understand what is happening. The second point which comes about is that how do we understand these realities in the contemporary period with something so dated as 19th century? And I'd sort of flag off against certain kind of empirical phenomena which are as relevant today as it were, probably 150 or 200 years ago. Take the example of capitalism, industries, take the question of technology, take the question of migration, take the question of communication, take the question of alienation, take the question of marginalized, take the question of dispossessed, inequalities, questions of a quest for finding meaning in a world which becomes instrumentally defined. All of it still remains relevant to us. It's not irrelevant. What we have to do is not throw the baby with the bathwater, but what we have to do is engage with the scholarship which the classical theories provide us and understand the contemporary, because these thinkers were thinkers and theorists of modernity. We in the contemporary period continue to inhabit modernity, not the same modernity as 21st century, but a modernity which has been shaped by the processes which were initiated during that period of time. It's important, therefore, to look at these classical theories as a body of knowledge and perspectives which will enable you to understand not only the structures which you confront, not only your everyday life, but the manner in which the individual and the society conjoin, the manner in which your personal problems become what are public issues or public quests. Thank you very much for today.
With this note, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for giving us a deep insight into the classical sociological theories. And as you explained in the lecture itself, how the theorists, how the thinkers, they have propagated and given the theories. Ma'am, can we say that the theories which were written or which were propagated at that time with the modernity or with the passage of time or with the decades, the theory exists, or does it suit the present society also?
You see, the classical theories are probably called classical theories because they had something which had an ability to sustain itself over a period of time, like you have classical literature. And they were people who were discussing the processes which define modernity. We are still in a world defined by the processes they talked about, like capitalism, like science and technology, like division of labor. But what has changed is the form and manner of capitalism. At that point, we had large industries, manufacturing. Today, we have large service sectors. But many of the key processes which existed at that point of time, which these thinkers addressed, remain today. Look at specialization of Durkheim, division of labor. Look at the question of Marx when he talks about profit maximization and the labor being either hired or fired depending upon the needs of the capitalists. Many of them remain today. So I would think that it's worth looking at them and being open to the idea that perhaps many of them need to be tweaked in order to understand the contemporary context. Thank you.
Definitely. So, dear friends, we believe that you might have gathered maximum of the knowledge from today's lecture. So, if you want to give your feedback for this particular lecture, then do write to us at info.cec@nic.in. This is the ID on which you can post your questions, as well as you can give your suggestions, feedbacks, or if you want to have a lecture on a particular topic which you felt that have not covered so far, then do contact to us on the same ID, that is info.cec@nic.in. All the lectures pertaining to the series are there on the YouTube for you. So friends, this lecture is also going to be uploaded on YouTube very soon for you. So keep watching the lectures, and afterwards, if you feel that there is some point or there is some query which is required to be answered, yes, of course, contact us. We will try to give answers to your questions when next time Professor Maitri Chaudhary visits our studio. So with this note, we would like to thank Professor Maitri Chaudhary once again for her precious input to the lecture. And yes, friends, do write us and keep watching us. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you once again.